Oh no, it's the Barry Harris police. Ah! So today I wanted to talk about bebop scales, okay? So with a lot of the stuff with Barry Harris's teachings and what I've learned from them, when it comes to pass on that information, whatever form I can, whatever limited form I can, the challenge is always to decide to what extent to adopt familiar terms. For those who don't know, Barry Harris has lots of very specific terms in his teaching, and they're there for a reason. It allows him to very quickly communicate in classes exactly what he wants people to do. So, for instance, if he says an arpeggio, that means something very specific. It means a 4-note arpeggio with the first note doubled up an octave. So, for instance, a triad, G, is like that, right? A triad would just be 3 notes. A chord would be, a 4-note 7th chord, and so on, right? So it's all very specific. He's not doing this to kind of be obscure. He's just doing it so he can really sort of nail exactly what he wants at any one time. And if you've ever been to one of Barry's classes, you'll realise how rapid fire they are. It's coming at you thick and fast, and having that simple kind of direct terminology really helps. But obviously, most people who are not Barry Harris students are not familiar with this. So when it comes to making YouTube videos, I often have to come at it a little bit sideways. So the term bebop scales is one of these things. The term that Barry Harris likes to use is added note scales, added note scale rules. Okay, the bebop scale is more familiar from conventional jazz education textbooks. So most of the stuff, Mark Levine Jazz Theory book, any stuff like that, it's a term you're likely to have come across. But the bebop scale that we're most familiar with really is a very simplified version of what is kind of actually in Barry Harris's teaching quite a complex and multifaceted area. Okay, but that's not to say that basic bebop scale isn't endlessly useful. So I associate, by the way, the term bebop scale most strongly with the educator David Baker, who, aside from being a very famous jazz educator, was also a very fine composer as well. And I think he played cello and trombone, and was obviously an expert jazz improviser. His books, How to Play Bebop, are one of the kind of most consulted texts on how to play bebop, basically. So well worth a look if you quite fancy getting into this, but perhaps you might find that Barry Harris's material is a little bit inaccessible to start off with. Okay, so, excuse me. So, what is a bebop scale? Well, I'm just going to focus on the dominant scale. Both Baker and Barry Harris use the dominant scale as basically the basic fulcrum of their teaching. So the basic first thing that we learn is how to use a dominant scale, how to add notes to it, and then how to use it in all different contexts. And I think that's a great way of going. Barry Harris has a term which is let the dominant dominate. That's what he says. And if you think about a lot of bebop, then we're not necessarily that interested in what happens on the minor or major chord per se. We're kind of very interested in the resolution. I had just one note from the 1 chord there. It's actually impossible to tell whether it's a major or minor. Okay, so we don't play the 1 chord too much in bop, or at least not when we're practicing. In fact, actually, there's lots of things you can do on the 1 chord, but I think getting that relation, getting the dominants in and understanding how to resolve them to a target chord is perhaps the real strong first step towards developing a really good understanding of traditional changes playing, jazz and bebop and everything else. Okay, cool. So what is it? Well, I mean, first of all, what is a dominant scale? So the dominant scale is something you might be more familiar with as the Mixolydian mode. And on G, so in key of C, on G7 chord, it would be G, A, B, C, D, E, F, 7 F sharp. So it's like a major scale with a lowered 7th, right? Mixolydian is, I think, a not very good term. It doesn't really mean anything. I know people talk about ancient Greece, but I think all these names are pretty, this wasn't the Mixolydian mode in use in ancient Greece. It's a different thing. And it sort of originated, I think, in the sort of much later in the Renaissance, but the words are all sort of mixed up anyway. And in terms of how we use them in jazz, we use them on the dominant chord. So calling them the dominant scale, or calling that scale the dominant scale, kind of makes a lot of sense to me. So for instance, on the minor chord, you have a minor scale. On the major chord, you have a major scale. And on the dominant chord, you have a dominant scale. And from the point of view of pedagogy, that's flipping simple. With those three chord types, you can play anything. Like dominants relate to half diminished and full diminished chords, and so on. So it's better to have, I think, a simple correspondence between the chord and the scale you play over it. At least that's what I think. So I'm going to use the term dominant scale. Apologies if you can't get your head around that, if you're used to Mixolydian. I prefer the term dominant scale. It just seems simpler and clearer to me. Okay? So a standard dominant scale, if we were just going down from 1, down from the G, from the tonic, or the root, should I say, of the G7 chord, then we're going to have this effect. 1, 2, 3, 4, and. So we end on an and. And actually, when we sort of start putting lines and scales and arpeggios together, it's really helpful to end on a chord tone. So what we can do to make that happen is simply add in an extra note. And the most common place to add this extra note in is between the 7th and the 1. So between G and F. We add in an F sharp or a G flat. And 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. Now here's the first thing, right? If I play this in another rhythm, you might recognize that, right? That's how I remember the sound of it. And that scale is much older than bop and much older than jazz, really. And when you think about it, it's very simple. You've got 7 notes in a standard sort of diatonic scale, and you've got 4 beats in a bar, maybe 8 quavers or 8 eighth notes, So to have an extra note in the scale rounds it out and squares it off and makes it much more usable. So you'll find examples of this kind of stuff in common practice music, classical music, romantic music, everything else. Okay, so I find this quite an easy thing to finger on the guitar, just because, and technically it works very nicely as a 4 notes a string thing. So for instance, if I start up here, that's 4 notes, slide down, it's another 4 notes. So very even, very balanced, and you can go from up there to down there without too much difficulty. So that's great. That's absolutely brilliant. And anything with an even number of notes on the strings, I find is a lot easier to pick. Whether you're upward or downward with your pick slanting, it's a Troy Grady thing, by the way. I find like it just makes it natural. Sorry, it wasn't quite a G. It just your hand just does that, so it's really easy to alternate pick. So you can play it very clearly without any problem. So a few things to make note of. First of all, this only really works if you start from a chord tone of G7. So if I start from the 3rd, which is a B, that works fine. If I start from the 5th, which is a D, let's start up here. That's fine as well. And if I start from 7. Now, I know people get terribly excited by the notion that all the chord tones line up with the beat, but that's actually less important than where it ends up. The way Barry Harris says it, he says it makes the scale come out right. Coming out right is an important thing if you want to then maybe join an arpeggio or some other figure onto the end of it. So for instance, with a more complex version of the Barry Harris added note scale rules, there's a more complex bebop scale that uses every note of the chromatic scale. You get this kind of thing. Okay, that's every note of the chromatic scale, but it still very strongly outlines a G7 chord. But it doesn't necessarily have every single note on the beat being a chord tone, although all the chord tones are on the beat. But it's kind of more important where it ends up. And actually, if you take a scale through, a bebop scale through 1 octave, we end up on the beat, and you can carry on for another octave. Now, those rules change when we start on a non-chord tone. So, for instance, an A on a G7 chord, we don't add in the extra tone. And then we carry on. So we can carry on because we've ended up on 1, we carry on with the normal bebop scale as if it was going from 1. So we go like that, right? for instance. Okay. Now, if we start on an upbeat, the rules are reversed. So if I start on an upbeat with a G, starting with the G, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1. We don't add any extra half step. If I start from the A, but on the offbeat, then we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Okay, and we end up on the B. There's other things you can do. So, for instance, like I think a lot of people get very sort of hung up on the fact there's a, you know, in this case, an F sharp in the scale. And that's not really terribly important. That note is really just rhythmic filler. It doesn't really have any harmonic significance. So if I wanted to add in a note a half step below the seventh, I could do this. And have exactly the same effect, right? Barry Harris says the rule is more important than the note. Okay, so when we come out right of the scale, or we come out correctly out of the scale, then it's relatively simple to add other things onto it. So for instance, if I take this, we end up on the third. So I can play a little arpeggio there, for instance, or I could go down a little bit further. You see, it all sounds very nice. For instance, you know, you can add it onto arpeggios or chords, as Barry Harris would call them, through the scale, and you can very rapidly come up with convincing sounding language on dominant chords. So that's a real bonus, okay? And it's really about creating language. You could use any of the what we call in Barry Harris land the brothers and sisters, but people might know as kind of the related dominant chords using diminished scale. So, you know, G7, and you have B flat 7, and you have D flat 7. That's the main one. I mean, you can also play E7 as well, but that's less common. So, for instance, I can do a dominant scale on the tritone substitution. Then resolve, maybe a simpler one like this. See, it's nice. For instance, you know, or I can use my favourite, the back door, so B flat 7 going into C major. And using a diminished chord to join up there to the C major. Okay, so that's basically the main use of them. And if you're interested in digging deeper in terms of what you can do with them, I would definitely recommend checking out Barry Harris. But as I say, David Baker may be more accessible for those who are ready to take the plunge. So I want to talk a little bit about phrasing. Most bebop scales are played descending. So descending, we tend to have an emphasis on the upbeat. So you might want to think about that when you're thinking of fingerings for your scales. For instance, one thing I like to do is this. I like to take a standard G7 bop scale, and I like to go. So I like to slide into the seventh, and also into the third. Adds a little bit of swing. Although it does make it a little bit harder to pick, to be fair. Like that, right? So, I mean, you could do that, you know. Or you can accent them. Yeah, which can add an extra sort of level of swing and interest to the line. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is odd times. So I know people, you know, like obviously a lot of Barry Harris's teaching is geared around 4/4. I don't know how terribly interested he is in things like 5 and 7, but certainly we have lots of standard jazz repertoire in 3, and you might, you know, obviously want to play in 7 or 5. So in that case, for any sort of time signature that has a 4 in the denominator, in the bottom, it's absolutely fine to use bebop scales. So for instance, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1 works absolutely fine. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Same rules. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That it was in 5, right? So it works fine. So where you might come into problems is for the 8s, 7, 8, 5, 8. In case of 7, 8, the rules can be reversed. It's as if you're starting each bar with an upbeat. Ba, 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 ba. Yeah? Ba, 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 ba. But if you do ba, 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 you do end up on the beat eventually, right? So that's quite funny. And 5, I know, doon, doon, go, goon, go, goon, go, goon, go, 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 go. Eventually it works, but go, 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 go. You can just play the scale normally as well. So, I mean, if you're playing in 5/8, good luck. But anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you find it helpful. Bye.